Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discussions, our discoveries, and our explorations with respect to the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2023. And that brings us to that title, which has been designated by Criterion at Spy Number 1167. This is a work which is described as being from the year 1934, and the name of the filmmaker is John M. Stahl, and the name of the work is Imitation of Life. This is the work from the year 1934, and it is based upon the novel by Fannie Hurst, and the screenplay is credited to William Hurlbut, with a really fascinating cast, included in which are, for example, Claudette Colbert and Louise Beavers and Freddie Washington and Ned Sparks and others. This is the work which is directed by John M. Stahl, and it is this work which is Imitation of Life. So the Criterion Collection has released this film, Imitation of Life, on this really very interesting Blu-ray release, and we'll talk a little bit more later in this discussion about the specifics of this release in particular. But before we get to that, let us try to attempt to speak about the plot or story structure of this work, Imitation of Life. And I think already we can come upon the point that this can be said to be very multi-leveled, in that, among other things, we have more than one set or line of plot or story dynamic. One can say arguably we have two primary storylines that seem to converge or run parallel to each other. Now, I use the word parallel, or you also use in alternate the word converge. Perhaps the latter is more apropos, because we have perhaps at the heart of this set or series of plot lines, we have the relationship between the Claudette Colbert character, who is Beatrice or B, and we have the Louise Beavers character, who is Delilah. And they're meeting each other, and in essence, their relationship with each other forms the means by which we as viewers can get to know more about their own backgrounds and their own lives and their own relationships respectively. And so for the Claudette Colbert character and her storyline revolving around her attempt and endeavors to try to find some kind of financial and emotional stability with both her work and her life. And her life, as we know it from meeting her at the start of the film, is in essence her relationship with her young daughter, and this is Jessie. And we see that relationship forming the core or backbone for this plot involving the Claudette Colbert Beatrice character, because as her life progresses and her own, say, financial stability or her own position professionally seems to be not just established, but also grows and grows in sort of public renown and esteem, as well as monetarily. We also understand, too, that there are relationship dynamics that are inserted into the work involving her own romantic or potentially romantic love interests that form the romantic or drama or melodramatic points of the film, I think in a very entertaining way, that also perhaps involve a type of one can say maybe potential love triangle tension that also involves her relationship with her daughter. So this forms, one can say, one parallel track of plot line that forms one of the bases for the propulsion forward of this work, Imitation of Life. Now, as we know, that is not the end of the story, because going back to the original, say, impetus of my approach to the plot here, namely the meeting or the relationship between Claudette Colbert's character and Louise Beaver's character, Delilah, the other component, and perhaps to many, it's considered to be perhaps one of the most important reasons why this film and the story Imitation of Life is so famous as it is the storyline involving Louise Beaver's character Delilah. And Delilah, we understand, is she comes to, through certain, say, very fortuitous circumstances, she comes to meet Bee, and through, again, a set of plot, say, mechanics, or a series of sort of plot steps forward, we understand that she comes to be working for Beatrice as a maid, as a housekeeper, and through that relationship with Bee, she forms a very close emotional bond with her, becoming, in a sense, very close. And through that close kinship between Bee and Louise Beaver's Delilah, there are a number of things that appear. So first of all, Delilah's own, knowledge and intelligence and experience involving the pancakes and cooking, which form a very key component of the financial and business ventures of Bee and Company. This forms one of the sort of plot dynamic bases for the close connection between Louise Beaver's Delilah and Claudette Colbert's Bee. On the one hand, that's not the end of the story, of course, because we also have the plot line involving another very key and important character to this film. That is the character of Delilah, who is portrayed by Louise Beavers. And we have her plot, or her story, not just involving her relationship with Claudette Colbert's Beatrice, but also Delilah's own family relationship, and specifically the relationship that she has with her daughter, Peola, who's portrayed by Freddie Washington. So we have the two parallel tracks: the Claudette Colbert Beatrice or Bee storyline with her daughter, and then we have the Louise Beavers Delilah storyline involving, among other things, her own relationship with her daughter Peola. So these form the two tracks, and then there is a type of convergence or intersection between the two, primarily found at the relationship between Beatrice or Bee and Delilah. Now, speaking a little bit, or focusing our attention on the Delilah storyline, we understand that from almost immediately when we meet them, Delilah agrees to be the companion or housekeeper to Bee or Beatrice, but she also is a type of confidant or friend, a very, very close and intimate personal friend to Beatrice in a number of ways. They become so close to each other that their own family stories become each other's own concern. So, and also they have an intertwined, partnership in terms of their financial and business entrepreneurial efforts and ventures that are focused primarily on the culinary skills of Delilah. Not just the culinary skills, of course, but also the image of Delilah as well, and we'll get to that a little bit later when we talk about the race and race-related themes of this film and how this film handles those. But these form, again, very important components of not just the Bee and Delilah relationship, and not just the plot line involving the entrepreneurial success of these characters, but also involving Delilah herself as a character, and among other things, how she relates to the Claudette Colbert character and the other characters of the piece, and these are those characters being white. And then the Delilah character and her positioning vis-a-vis this entrepreneurial relationship, including, among other things, the use of her image as an African-American woman, which has sort of connections, both direct and indirect, to the notion of the stereotyping, the quote-unquote so-called mammy figure in the sort of very derogatory, excuse me, black African-American stereotyping, which has become part of the focus of a lot of the literature and a lot of the scholarship that is focused on imitation of life and other works. And we'll get to a little bit of that when we talk about some of the supplements that deal and discuss these points of this film with a lot of care and a lot of attention. But we have, therefore, that aspect of the racial and race-related and race relations dynamics that also form the backbone of the plot of the film Imitation of Life, keyed into this parallel storyline that finds at the focus or center the character of Delilah. Now, there is another key relationship, right? That between Delilah and Peola, her daughter. Now, this also forms not just that type of emotional and dramatic impetus that the, I think, very emotionally resonant and quite almost in many ways tumultuous relationship between mother and daughter here provide in terms of Hollywood cinematic entertainment. But also we have, or perhaps included in which, or alongside that, or perhaps fundamentally linked to that, is also the race component and how race is handled and identity is handled here, because Peola is very light-skinned in terms of skin tone or skin color, and this brings into the conversation this very important conversation about dark skin tone and light skin tone, and how this, in the context of, say, the relationship between Delilah, the mother, and Peola, the daughter, how this could be said to be one of the fundamentally key areas of the, say, the hardships or the difficulties that face this relationship between mother and daughter. In particular, the way in which the mother tries to provide a sense of emotional stability to her daughter's life, but the fact that her daughter and the way that she looks seems to, for her, from her perspective, inform or tries to inform who she perceives herself to be. This then creates a type of for lack of a better phrase, difficulty that's presented in the film, and also this type of tension between mother and daughter that will also find a type of conclusion or a plot step forward to the ultimate, say, climax or resolutions of this film, Imitation of Life. Now, this dynamic of race relations and race identity that is linked to the skin tone of the characters, and specifically the skin tone, the light skin tone of Peola, portrayed by Freddie Washington. This then brings into the conversation, I think in a very vivid way, the idea of race identity, or identity that is based upon or has linked to it in terms of the way in which one perceives one's own identity in the context of race. Now, this is also very important because it touches upon race relations in the United States during this time, the 1930s. It also, perhaps in an indirect way, touches upon the ways in which this film might be trying to perceive itself as being a type of championing of certain, say, social issues or social causes, for lack of a better phrase, in terms of bringing this theme or this discussion or conversation to the fore in this film. Now, of course, judge for yourselves whether or not this film succeeds on that level in terms of actually, in a substantive and constructive way, deals and talks about these issues of social concern and also race and race relations. Perhaps to some it might seem quite dated and quite outdated in that regard, especially when reviewing it from the lens of the 21st century. Although, of course, this can also lead to another, I think, very robust conversation about depictions of race and race relations as shown in this film Imitation of Life, or the story Imitation of Life, the 1930s John M. Stahl work. But be that as it may, those themes or elements are still present. They are quite evidently present, and they are present in a way that form the key and direct, say, points of impetus forward for a very key plot of the film, Imitation of Life. So it's very much there. There are also aspects of that when one enters into a conversation of race and race relations dynamics as handled in this work, Imitation of Life. There are also elements that create a sense of nuance, potentially anyway, in the conversation. And this is where I will rely on some of the great points that are raised in the supplements of this release, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in this discussion. But for the time being, let me then point out that, yes, this film is renowned for a number of reasons, and perhaps for many people across many a generation and many critics and many audience members, people who have admired this film and watched this film for the years since its original release up to now, people regard the Delilah storyline, the Louise Beaver storyline and Freddie Washington storyline, of the two storylines, to be the primary and perhaps most, quote-unquote, most important of the two. And in fact, you'll often see this film, Imitation of Life, described in its plot, say synopses or write-ups or descriptions, to be focusing in on the Delilah and Peola storyline, and then contextualizing this work in the context of race relations as we see them, or as they are perceived by Hollywood, by the filmmaking industry, through works like Imitation of Life in the 1930s United States. And so therein lies, I think, a lot of rich and potentially very substantive areas of discussion and points of discussion that lead the way, again, coming all the way from this film, which is John M. Stahl's Imitation of Life. So there's a lot here. And of course, we can take it for, at face value. And then, of course, we can take these things beyond face value. And we can take them to more points of discussion from a historical context, a social context, as well as a context of, say, Hollywood filmmaking, etc. And I think that's, again, where I will rely on the great expertise of some of the participants in the supplemental material that we will, again, talk about a little bit later. But now, bringing this conversation back to the plot, or just trying to round out this or conclude this part of the discussion here, let me then say that it is also very multi-leveled, in that in these regards, in these family dynamics, we also get a number of other things that emerge. Of course, we have the stories of women. And these are women who are, when they meet each other, they are not in relationships. They are not, for certain reasons, which may or may not be revealed early on. They find themselves trying to independently find their footing, both in terms of financial stability and emotional stability. And so this is, I'll rely on some of the great comments of Imogen Sarah Smith in her great discussion about how John M. Stahl, among his many traits as a filmmaker in terms of his filmography, one of the traits that one can identify is the ways in which he focuses on the strength of his female characters. And I think we have Louise Beaver's Delilah, as well as Claudia Colbert's Beatrice, being, I think, two very excellent examples of this, as Imogen Sarah Smith also asserts, I think, with a great deal of a very compelling discussion. and quite well argued and well discussed on her part, by the way, and we'll get to her discussion, as I say, a little bit later. So this is another important component of the film. Also, the drama or key melodramatic moments, and I mentioned the word melodramatic again in a very positive light because that adds to the entertainment value of this film, namely the romance elements, the relationships involving some of the comedic aspects that are Ned Sparks and company, that are related to the rise of the entrepreneurial business ventures of primarily B, but of course related to Delilah, but also the romantic interests of the sort of love triangles that emerge, as well as some of the details and dynamics involving the efforts trying to again establish oneself in terms of finding or founding a business and making it in this world, etc. Again, this also then leads to some great focused attention to the performances of the work. Of course, attention has to be given to Claudette Colbert and Louise Beavers in this regard. I think each of them provides some real heart to their own respective roles, and they have different things going on at once, as we've been trying to explain. But of course, another thing too is they have to occur while the two of them have this emotional relationship, and it's that emotional relationship between Claudette Colbert's B and Louise Beavers' Delilah. This relationship is arguably the one that this film rests upon. So the success of this film could be said to be resting upon the success or failure of the believability of the relationship between these two main characters. And so I think the fact that the film works so well in the eyes of many, I think could be said to be coming from or emanating from the success of this relationship, which in turn could be said to be coming from, in large part, due to the greatness of the performances of these two actors, respectively. So there is a lot going on here. There's a lot going on here in terms of this work, Imitation of Life, and this Criterion Collection release. There are some things that I think should be noted in terms of what is included and what's not included, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But above everything else, the occasion of this release by Criterion at the start or the early part of 2023, I think, is another great chance, another great reason to revisit this film, this version of the film as well, because as some of you may know, there has been more than one famous film version of this story. But what we have here in the Criterion release is the John M. Stahl version, the 1930s version, which is very strong. It again provides a lot of potential for discussion of very key socially significant themes, both at face value in terms of the film itself and also beyond in terms of the wider social and historical construct and context upon which this film is based, as well as being a very entertaining work and also providing a number of plot threads and subplots that I think give us, the viewers, a lot to consider and a lot to be absorbed by when we watch this work. This is the film directed by John M. Stahl, which is Imitation of Life. The Criterion Collection has released this film, Imitation of Life. Again, it's at spy number 1167, and I have this Blu-ray release right here, this single disc Blu-ray. I've taken the liberty of removing the booklet or the fold-out leaflet, which is part of the package of this release, and the reason why I've done that now is we'll talk a little bit later about some of the other details, but it does talk about the restoration or the restoration materials that have been relied upon for purposes of this Criterion release. And so I quote, "About the restoration, Imitation of Life is presented in its original aspect ratio of 1.33 to 1. This digital restoration by Universal Pictures Home Entertainment was created in 4K resolution on an Oxberry film scanner from a 35mm nitrate composite fine grain from the Library of Congress and a 35mm silent safety duplicate negative. additional audio restoration was performed by the Criterion Collection. So this is very interesting because, as we may know, this film, Imitation of Life from the 1930s, has been released on a number of occasions prior to this new 2023 Criterion release. For example, we have this release right here, which is the Blu-ray of Imitation of Life, and this is the Universal release of this. And this is very significant because it has not just the film, the John M. Stahl film, but it also has the Douglas Sirk film from the 1950s as well. And so this is a double feature Blu-ray release of this. But it does include the John M. Stahl 1930s work. And I must say that, and this is also purported to be based on what's referred to here as digitally remastered and fully restored from high-resolution 35mm original film elements. Now, I should point out that, again, my eyes and my ears are very inexperienced when it comes to trying to track and trace, say, the differences, both say, general and minute, in terms of various versions and releases and presentations that come for every single or for many film release that we talk about, say in the Criterion Collection or otherwise. So I'm very inexperienced when it comes to these sorts of matters. I try my very best, however, from my own subjective experience. And so from my own subjective take, again, not claiming to be in any way a type of expert when it comes to all of the release versions of Imitation of Life. Now, with those limitations acknowledged, let me say that to my eyes and ears, I could not necessarily find any strong discernible difference between that which I found watching the John M. Stahl version on this Universal Blu-ray release and when I was watching the film by the Criterion Collection here. I note that the notes indicate that this version is based upon a restoration made by Universal, so that can suggest to me that we may be talking about similar, if not same, elements. Now, again, I'm not sure, but that's what it seems to me in terms of my eyes. Now, the notes also indicate that there was additional work done to the soundtrack by the Criterion Collection, and so I'm going to have to watch it again and trying to catch some of the differences, again, perhaps from a comparative perspective on these and other releases. So I'm afraid to say that I wasn't able to catch any discernible differences in terms of the soundtrack, but I do note that it does note that Criterion did do some additional work on the soundtrack. And so that indicates to me at least the possibility that there could be some differences in sound that could be quite significant indeed. Again, to my very limited expertise, and it is very limited indeed, I was not able to discern anything, and I tried, but I will try again over the course of my exploration and visiting and revisiting of this film, Imitation of Life. Now, that also brings me to another point about this, and this will lead me into a discussion of the supplements. Oh, actually, let me say this too before I get to that further. Now, that also at the end of the day, in terms of the presentation, means that we are still getting a very robust, a lovely looking and lovely sounding version when you get the Criterion release. So if you have the earlier release, this might be for you the way to go, and maybe you don't have to opt for the Criterion Collection release. However, if you are in the neighborhood of wanting to, or at least considering whether or not to get Imitation of Life, the John M. Stahl version, this Criterion Collection release might be the way to go. So again, it's up to you and your own, say, needs and your own plans as a consumer of these products. But in any event, this does provide, I think, a really good opportunity, a really good chance to visit this film when it comes to Criterion Collection, or when it comes to the Imitation of Life presentation. Because I think, regardless of whether it might have similarities and very strong similarities with, say, other presentation physical media releases, this is still a great opportunity to get this film if you haven't done so already. So, and there are also other differences that we will talk about in terms of the supplements a little bit later. But that's my way to say that if you are interested in getting this film, I think the Criterion Collection release is a good opportunity to do so. But however, just please keep in mind that there are other possibilities as well, and perhaps this will be a good chance to talk about the supplements that come with the Criterion Collection release of Imitation of Life. So now let's talk about the supplements that can be found with this Criterion Collection release of Imitation of Life. And so there are three supplements that can be found. Yes, there are three. Yes, so that might seem to be somewhat lacking in quantity. So we'll talk a little bit about the quantity aspect of that somewhat later in this discussion. But first, let's talk about the quality of these supplements. And indeed, the quality runs very, very high per the standards of Criterion, I think, that we all have been accustomed to. A Criterion is Criterion for a number of reasons, because the quality standard is quite high. And so I think in terms of the supplemental material that we find here accompanying their release of Imitation of Life, the quality standard is, I think, without doubt, up there. These are really strong discussions. And so the first discussion is with Imogen Sarah Smith. And this is described as being an introduction to the film. But it could also be said to be a type of introduction when it comes to, or a primer, or an overview of the work of John M. Stahl and the filmmaking career of John M. Stahl. And Imogen Sarah Smith, in this sit-down conversation that she has, goes through, in this 24 minutes, and it's described as being from the year 2022, this discussion that she has is it's exemplary. It is brilliant. Her discussions, whenever she is discussing a point somewhere in a Criterion Collection release, my strong suggestion is sit down, play the discussion, and listen to her comments and points. She is a critic. She is a historian. She is a very keen observer, and she has so much knowledge about, in this case, Imitation of Life, and bringing us through that discussion into a contextual discussion of the life and times and career of John M. Stahl, the director of this film, Imitation of Life. And so she points to certain aspects of his biographical detailed life, or perhaps lack of detail, in a manner speaking, which she clarifies from the very start in terms of where he was born. This is also very interesting as well. And also, this leads to some of his early works, and also the vastness of his filmography, which she also touches upon, and also some of the themes that can be said to be part of a larger, say, contextual conversation about the filmography writ large of John M. Stahl. And here she mentions this idea of devotion, the strength of the female characters that are found in a lot of the John M. Stahl stories, and this idea too of, in her words, self-sacrifice and a type of struggle, as she describes it, as Imogen Sarah Smith here describes it. And then she brings that into the fore when, or she brings that into back into a discussion of Imitation of Life, because one can say as well that Imitation of Life does have the embodiment of this type of, say, a presentation of character or character dynamics, at least from a certain perspective anyway, at least, and definitely with our main characters. In particular, Delilah and Bee, and also very arguably characters like Piola as well. So this is very important, right? And she does talk too about other themes as well that seem to be very inherent in John M. Stahl's stories, namely handling of motherhood, how parents and children, and specifically motherhood, how this forms a lot of the dynamic, the emotional resonance of his films, as well as a type of source of drama that really give his films, I think, a lot of the sense of the memorable resonance films like Imitation of Life. And then also we have the ways in which racial themes or race-related themes are handled by John M. Stahl and company. So this also then, of course, brings into the conversation Imitation of Life. And here, Imogen Sarah Smith also talks about and addresses, I think, very directly about how, again, we can read this film face value in the context of, say, race relations and race-related themes. And if we read the film at face value, one can perhaps come away feeling somewhat disappointed, somewhat deflated even, because there are, I think, very direct ways in which this film, again at face value, seems to be almost maybe not just acknowledging, but perhaps even could be said to be condoning, or perhaps could be said to be almost forgiving this treatment of the character of Delilah and the appropriation of her image in a way that could be itself said to be quite racist in terms of the appropriation of her image and the ways in which her image is used not just in arguably a type of financially exploitative way, but also in a way that is very demeaning to her from the context of race and stereotypes and the quote-unquote mammy stereotype that is very much, I think, very evident in the way in which her image is used in the context of the plot of Imitation of Life. So again, that's face value of the film. But what Imogen Sarah Smith and others will try to remind us of is that this is a film that can also be taken from a reading outside of face value. And so she reminds us that in the context of 1930s, these discussions and these points being brought up the way they are being brought up, I think is very significant. This idea of the appropriation of the image of Delilah is also being told at the same time as a story of the relationship between her and her daughter, Piola. And indeed, and as time has shown us, and as history has shown us, that storyline is perhaps, of the two storylines of the film, the more powerful of the two. And that now has become almost top billing. So in other words, Delilah's storyline vis-a-vis her daughter is now the top billed storyline of the two storylines, right? And so in that way, it becomes, and that idea of the focusing in on this idea of race identity and how it connects to a skin tone and how that also goes into a discussion of what's referred to as passing, the idea that maybe African Americans, for certain reasons, might have made the choice to try to pass as white in the context of, say, their relationships with, from a societal perspective. Now, whether there is a type of moral, there is, of course, a type of moral dimension to this conversation, which is touched upon in this film, Imitation of Life. But I think one of the Imogen Sarah Smith's assertions as to the strength of this film, or one of the strengths of this film, is that it doesn't make the moral dimensions of Piola's choice, it doesn't make that part of the direct nature of this film in terms of her relationship with her mother. There are, of course, ways in which that story is presented in the context of a Hollywood film, mind you, but the point is that I think there is room for the idea of looking at that choice that Piola makes and seeing it not necessarily in very either or types of terms, but rather in a more nuanced fashion. And again, this is looking at the film at face value, namely the film as is, and perhaps looking at the film as is, it might seem very, very either or. It is or it isn't type of choice. And that's a very fair reading to make. But again, what Imogen Sarah Smith and others, I think very strongly assert, and very convincingly assert, is that this film can be taken beyond that. It can be read beyond that. And the more we think about the Piola dynamic, for instance, the more we realize, or the more we wonder why she's making the choice that she is. What are some of the emotional and economic choices that might be going into her thinking in making the decision that she is? After all, we do see Piola in certain instances involving her state of her life, say working at her job, etc. And so this has, I think, a kind of fundamental, albeit indirect, link to the idea of passing and choices that are made because of, say, maybe economic reasons. Perhaps this was this idea of social mobility and this idea, too, of capitalism. Now, if that's the case, then query whether these notions, these grandiose notions of capitalism and social mobility, which again, on a very general and grandiose platform, can be oftentimes lauded and celebrated. Now, query whether indeed these are quite, say, socially ambitious and progressive modes, or perhaps they are the reasons why choices like the ones that Piola makes occur. And so that brings into the fold, therefore, a very nuanced discussion of the moral ambiguity surrounding social mobility in the context of quote-unquote passing, which is in turn setting forth against the backdrop of race relations and racial identity, in particular in 1930s America. And so this is, again, my way to say that it is not just stopping at face value of the film, and this is what Imogen Sarah Smith very strongly and convincingly discusses. It actually lies beyond that, and the film Imitation of Life, I think, provides that opportunity for discussion very robustly and very powerfully, thus, again, bringing to where we started, which is that storyline with Delilah and Piola is, of the two storylines, arguably the more powerful and the more famous of the two, especially as history has been regarding this film Imitation of Life over the passage of years. So therefore, and also not to mention the psychological effects. I mentioned the emotional and perhaps economic reasonings behind these choices, but also there are some psychological effects, and those psychological effects do play themselves out in very powerful scenes in this film Imitation of Life, especially between mother and daughter, or how daughter regards mother, etc. So, again, this is all to say that Imogen Sarah Smith's discussion is brilliant. It is utterly, utterly brilliant. And every discussion that Imogen Sarah Smith has in every Criterion release where she appears is fantastic. I am a huge fan. And so please, my dear friends, please check out this discussion. It's an introduction. It's described as an introduction by Imogen Sarah Smith, who talks about aspects of this film, key social constructs of this film, how we can read this film at face value and beyond, and also in the context of John M. Stahl himself. And this is also really important too, which is, and let me just bring it up right now, which is one of the critiques perhaps of the Criterion Collection release could be that the Criterion Collection release only has the John M. Stahl version of the film. It doesn't have the Douglas Sirk version of the film, unlike, say, previous releases, which I've mentioned here. So I know that perhaps some regard that as being a kind of a critique of this Criterion release. And if you feel that way, I think you are very well within you are very reasonable to believe that and feel that way, because ultimately at the end of the day you are the consumer, and it is your choice whether or not to purchase this based upon things that are included or things that aren't. And one of the things that isn't included is the Douglas Sirk version from the 1950s. However, from my perspective, I think the non-inclusion of the Douglas Sirk version is very, very important. Now, I'm not taking away anything I'm not taking away my feelings or regard with respect to the Douglas Sirk version. I think that version is itself so brilliant and vivid and very powerful, and it's in its own way, both related and on its own, very nuanced indeed, the Douglas Sirk version. However, what I can also attest to is oftentimes in a discussion of Imitation of Life, and the various versions, one can say that the Douglas Sirk versions tends to dominate the conversation, and perhaps very innocently so. I mean, I don't think people necessarily mean any direct negativity against the John M. Stahl version, but it's just the Douglas Sirk version has a lot of prominence and a lot of renown. And it's very, very famous on in its own right, of course. And so it tends to, in that way, dominate the conversation a lot. In that regard, I, therefore, really appreciate the fact that this release, Imitation of Life, is standing on the basis of the John M. Stahl version only. It is the John M. Stahl version of Imitation of Life. This is the 1930s version of Imitation of Life, which itself is so fascinating, and I think it demands a type of inquiry and investigation and exploration in and of itself, of course related to the Sirk version, definitely, but also independently and on its own. And in that way, when you have this single version in its own independent and individual release, together with, say, a discussion by Imogen Sarah Smith, whose discussion focuses, or one of the focal points is the career of John M. Stahl. That is very refreshing indeed, and it therefore gives the spotlight, or a little bit of the spotlight, to John M. Stahl and this version of Imitation of Life. Now that's, again, not to take anything away from the Sirk version. That's not to take anything away from anyone who believes that the Sirk version is superior and who would have liked to have seen the Sirk version be included in this. That's, again, I'm very respectful, and I totally, very much appreciate that viewpoint that one might have. But my personal viewpoint is, it's great to have the spotlight shining on the Stahl version in this way to, again, highlight that the Stahl version is itself in its own way very, very important indeed. And not only we have the design of this release from Criterion, but also discussions by Imogen Sarah Smith to remind us of that point. And so for that and other reasons, I think it's really very, very valuable and definitely worth one's time, definitely, to please watch and listen to the great conversation by Imogen Sarah Smith about this work, Imitation of Life. But that's not all, because we have another brilliant discussion, one-on-one discussion, this time with author and scholar and historian Miriam J. Petty. And this is described as being from the year 2022, 19 minutes. Miriam J. Petty on Imitation of Life. She also, by the way, provides the essay part of this, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this discussion. But before we do, let us focus our attention on this utterly, utterly brilliant discussion with Miriam J. Petty. She focuses her comments on, say, the aspects of racial identity and race relations, etc., that can be found to be touched upon or discussed both directly and indirectly in the work Imitation of Life, and also against the backdrop or within the context of, writ large, 1930s America. So, and this also brings to the fore concepts and suggestions about how to read this film both at face value and beyond. And that point about going beyond also brings with it Miriam J. Petty's comments, brilliantly expressed with regard to production, the film industry in 1930s America, 1930s Hollywood, and also certain choices that could be said to have been almost compulsory in terms of some of the choices and some of the career trajectories of actors like, say, Louise Beavers on the one hand, or Freddie Washington on the other hand. And that's also one of the really interesting dynamics that Miriam J. Petty talks about, again, in the context of race and racial identity and racial politics, and also representations and relations, etc. So, and it's all interwoven, or it's all coming from, or it's, again, bringing back to a discussion, a focus on Imitation of Life and beyond. So Miriam J. Petty's discussion here is brilliant. This is top-notch stuff. This is the reason why labels like Criterion are labels like Criterion, it's because they bring such high-quality discussions like this, like Imogen Sarah Smith's discussion earlier. But Miriam J. Petty's discussion here is top-notch, brilliant stuff. And the way she expresses her points, it's so clear, it's so easy to follow, and it is also packed with so much information and insight that I saw this so many times, and I was taking notes and I was trying to write down everything that she was saying because it was amazing. And again, just so well thought out, and at the same time, so easily accessible, so easy to listen to, so pleasant. It's just, I cannot say enough just how much I thoroughly enjoyed this discussion with Miriam J. Petty, and she really knows. All of her observations are so on point. So, for example, she talks about some of the aspects of, say, the performance and also image and representation that are part of, say, the casting process, that are part of representation embedded in the film industry itself. I mean, it's one of the themes of the film, namely image and image representation and appropriation of Delilah's image for purposes of the business venture, which it could be said to be quite exploitative of Delilah herself, although she, at least in the context of what she says in the film, doesn't seem to mind. Now, Miriam J. Petty then, of course, takes that as I think a really wonderful opportunity to then also talk about some of the behind the scenes and Louise Beavers, and how Louise Beavers was, her career was very prolific, and that many of her roles would be as the housekeeper, and that would be, the domestic servant, and there would be also this almost heavy-set aspect as well, which then furthered, perhaps in the eyes of casting departments of Hollywood productions like Imitation of Life, furthered her quote-unquote appeal in terms of her outward appearance, and also how that seemed to be linked to perceptions of certain representations of race in Hollywood cinema in the 1930s. And again, Imitation of Life is one aspect of that. Her role as Delilah is also perhaps one example of that. Now, Miriam J. Petty doesn't at all cast any type of moral, say, judgment on that type of choice of actors like, say, Louise Beavers or others during this period of Hollywood cinema in the 1930s. On the contrary, Miriam J. Petty provides very crucial context as to why this is, or what were the circumstances that brought about these types of, say, careers in Hollywood, as it were. And I think a lot of it had to do with maybe what she suggests is a type of maybe quote unquote certain stereotypical images that were then used as part of the marketing of films, like these certain films in the 1930s. And she takes as a counterpoint to this the life and career of Freddie Washington, who plays the role of Peola, the daughter in the film. And she reminds us that, again, Peola is African American. Freddie Washington is African American. And so remember that one of the dynamics of the storyline of Peola is the character's own self-perception and the self-worth that she subjectively generates or doesn't generate, depending on the circumstances of that self-perception. That self-worth that is conceived based upon the tone or the skin color, the lightness of skin tone, relatively speaking, which then leads her to the choice of wanting to quote-unquote pass as white. Now, it is very important that Miriam J. Petty makes it a point, I think very appropriately, to remind us that Freddie Washington is African American. And so, but she, as a performer, as a professional actor, did not herself, quote unquote, pass in terms of the roles that she is known to have played. She was very prominently in roles in roles of African American characters. And so that, I think, brings to it a very interesting meta conversation about not just how Freddie Washington almost was trying to make a career as an African American performer. But relatively speaking to Louise Beavers, her career, as Miriam J. Petty points out, is not so prolific. And in fact, it's not as far-reaching as, say, the number of roles that Louise Beavers has. Now, that's not, again, to cast any moral judgment over one performer or the other. That's not what's going on here at all. But rather to point out this kind of ambiguity and this type of almost unfair ambiguity that occurs, namely that we have certain characters or certain performers that seem to be trying to, quote unquote, again, for lack of a better phrase, and again, please forgive me for my very poor, inartful way of expressing it, but there's this comment that is being made about how performers, African American performers, seem to perhaps find better success during this period in roles that could be said to be, quote unquote, very, very stereotypical, and in that way almost quite demeaning. But they find certain success, both career-wise and financially, therefore, as a result. And in that realm, they do find ways to maintain a sense of integrity and maintain a sense of maybe a sense of integrity of spirit, as well as integrity to one's own identity. And I think in the context of, say, Louise Beavers' career, Miriam J. Petty does mention two instances where she did try to convince the powers that be in certain productions to avoid certain, say, racial stereotypes, language, very, very demeaning, derogatory language, racial epithets and the sort. She tried to have these aspects removed from scripts, including some anecdotes regarding Imitation of Life, by the way. So that's not, again, to say that there's any type of moral judgment being cast down in this discussion. On the contrary, this is bringing to light some of the harsh realities of the professional actors that were involved in works like Imitation of Life and beyond, again, in 1930s America. And this itself becomes part of the discussion fabric when we're talking about Imitation of Life. And again, that's one of the reasons why we can look at this film beyond its cinema screen face value and look at it and really see how profound it is in terms of the many points that it touches upon in the context of race and race representation and identity and relations and the sort. And also, there's another interesting point too that she mentions here, which is that this film it had some issue with censors, and the reason was that the idea of Piola and and her choice to want to pass as white meant, of course, or it was derived in certain part because of her skin color. And certain censors perhaps perceive this to be an indication, maybe an unspoken indication that we're having issues also, or aspects or themes of what is known as miscegenation, or interracial relationships, which at the time was considered by censors and the powers that be, in particular, in the industry, to be very, very taboo topics. And of course, but as we know, the film doesn't touch upon those sorts of themes or discussions of miscegenation directly. So, but that's part of the discussion point, again, if we go beyond the face value of the film. So therefore, this becomes, I think, a really fascinating and interesting touchstone for a lot of discussion points. Again, keeping in mind the context of the film, 1930s America. And neither Imogen Sarah Smith nor Miriam J. Petty make the claim that this is a perfect discussion of those race-related themes. On the contrary, it could be said to be quite an imperfect discussion. I'm talking about the context of Imitation of Life. This is really important too. We see the film now, and perhaps it makes us uncomfortable. We see some scenes that I think are very, very, again, quite directly, can be said to be quite demeaning to certain characters. And but we can acknowledge that while at the same time understanding the context. And when we have a further discussion of the context as reminded to us, as elucidated to us, as taught to us, and as guided by the great voices such as Imogen Sarah Smith and such as Miriam J. Petty, then we come to realize that the work Imitation of Life is more than meets the eye. And that is, I think, the point of the great discussions like this. This is so great. Miriam J. Petty's discussion is, and it also goes into, again, she herself. It's not like the discussion casts any moral judgment, but she brings to light, Miriam J. Petty does, the aspect of how these choices, both in front of the camera and indeed behind the camera, do bring with it the potential of, quote unquote, what the phrase that's often used is betrayer of race. And this also then creates a sense of, or a type of sensibility. And it reminds us of how these choices are not always so clear. And this choice with respect to passing, with respect to maybe enabling certain stereotypical images to thrive in 1930s cinema, etc. These choices do not come, or are not without consequence. And perhaps there are certain negative voices as well that look upon these choices and see them as being, again, furthering the stereotypes of race representations in cinema, which itself could be said to be quite a negative thing. However, the choice is not always clear. And Miriam J. Petty reminds us that oftentimes there were maybe no other roles being made available. Maybe there are other things that, other choices, both economic and otherwise professionally related, that made it virtually impossible to do anything else. And so this is a reminder, too, of how there is this really fine line when it comes to not only when we as viewers view these films that have these quite almost directly, almost shocking scenes that can be said to be quite demeaning and quite offensive, perhaps in a number of circles, on the one hand. But again, we always have to look at it in context. We always have to see how this film is operating within the historical and social context of the times. It might not be perfect in our eyes, but it is still something that, when we think about the context, it becomes a very important discussion point indeed. And I should point out as well that I'm not asserting that from my own personal standpoint, and I'm not speaking at all as an expert. I'm not on the level of the expertise as people like Imogen Sarah Smith or Miriam J. Petty, not at all. So I'm not saying that I know everything about it, because I don't. I am very much a novice when it comes to this type of historical discussion. But my own personal cinema journey informs me that I know that, for example, this is not the most pioneering film when it comes to discussions of race and race relations and representations and identity that we have seen. Right, and it's not the most pioneering, and it's not the most convincing, again, at face value. You can, of course, look at, for example, the very famous examples that were set by filmmakers like Oscar Micheaux that happened in the 19-teens and the 1920s that predate a film like Imitation of Life, just as an example. And they do it with a lot of, say, a lot of directness and a lot of strength of handling of these themes that could be said to be very powerful, and perhaps even more powerful, again, at face value, than Imitation of Life. So I'm not suggesting that Imitation of Life itself is this, again, in terms of its face value contents, a type of pioneering work. But I don't think that's the claim that Imogen Sarah Smith or Miriam J. Petty is making here. On the contrary, it is, again, providing context. And when the context is provided, then we can see how this film is operating on many levels, both in front of the camera and behind the camera, both as a film made in the 1930s, but also a film that resonates within or beyond and among the wide expanse of the historical and social context of 1930s America. And in that regard, discussions like Miriam J. Petty's are so valuable indeed. I cannot stress enough just how much I appreciate this conversation. This is some of the best stuff in terms of supplements. This is why Criterion is Criterion. And so please, my dear friends, please check out this great conversation. It is with Miriam J. Petty on Imitation of Life, approximately 19 minutes. And then rounding out the supplements, we have a trailer for the film Imitation of Life, and this trailer is described as being the trailer cut for, and it's prepared for African-American audiences. And so therefore, when you watch the trailer, you'll see the focus is on Louise Beavers and Freddie Washington, that is the Delilah and Peola characters, respectively. And so, again, it's described in the supplemental or the supplemental submenu. So when you click on the submenu and you click on the trailer, you can find some information about that. It's fascinating in terms of how this film is therefore being marketed. It therefore also indicates, too, that even contemporary times will show that there is a certain consciousness that on the part of, say, the marketing of this film, that again focuses in on the quote-unquote importance or significance of the Delilah Peola storyline. Again, how far that's taken, again, we'll rely on the comments of historians like Miriam J to remind us of. But in any event, here is the trailer. That is the version of the trailer cut in this fashion, again, to round out the supplements. And so that's it as far as the supplements are concerned for this release of Criterion's Imitation of Life from 1934. So I must once again remind everyone that this is, it could be seen by a number of people to be lacking in quantity. And especially when we don't have things like, we don't have certain supplements that have appeared on other releases, such as this Universal release. For example, this Criterion release does not, unfortunately, have any commentary track to this film, Imitation of Life. That is a shame. That is a real shame, especially because we had a lovely commentary track to the 34 version, and also the other version, but also the 34 version of Imitation of Life that we found on this Universal Blu-ray release. That was by Avery Clayton. And so the fact that we had it on an earlier release before, but we don't have any Criterion commentary track for Imitation of Life, I'll be perfectly honest, that is a real shame. I wish there could have been a commentary track. At the very least, I wish there could have been a commentary track for this film. That's, again, not to take anything away from the brilliance of Imogen Sarah Smith's discussion or Miriam J. Petty's discussion or essay. And again, we'll get to that later. But it's a real shame. There could have been a great opportunity to try to carry this over. And again, if that wasn't possible due to rights or availability, then to try to create a new commentary track for this. Because not only do you have a lack of commentary, but we also have, again, in terms of number, in terms of quantity, very few supplements. Now, that, I think, becomes very conspicuous, especially when we remember that this will be compared to earlier releases. And if earlier releases had the Douglas Sirk version, but this doesn't, then the lack of a commentary track and the lack of quantity of supplements becomes, again, for better or worse, conspicuous. Now, I am trying my best to explain on the record that I personally find the quality very, very high. It is very high. I learned so much, and I continue to learn so much from Imogen Sarah Smith and Miriam J. Petty. So the fact that their discussions are here, brilliant. And I don't want the lack of quantity to take anything away from the brilliance of their conversations, because they are brilliant and they deserve to be recognized as much as possible and seen as much as possible. So that's not the point of what I'm about to say. But the point of it, what I'm about to say, is that it's a shame. It's a shame that there isn't more being done with Imitation of Life here. I'm reminded of, say, a previous release late last year of a great work like Arsenic and Old Lace. There was, relatively speaking, not much there in terms of quantity, although they did have a commentary track, if I recall correctly, with that. Now, Imitation of Life doesn't have the benefit of a commentary track as well. So, and I know that commentary tracks can be hit or miss. It's not like I enjoy every single commentary track that I've heard. There have been some real duds, in my view, over the years that I've listened to commentary tracks. But that being said, there's always an opportunity for further discussion. And if we know anything, one of the great beauties of cinema journeys is the discussion. And one of the great sources and examples of discussions are commentary tracks. So I so wish that this could be seen as a type of, if anything, a type of maybe turning point from Criterion to try to give us these releases that on paper, while they might look to be lacking in quantity, at the very least, try to give us something that will maybe alleviate that concern, at least on paper anyway. And perhaps one way to do that, to alleviate that concern on paper, is to try to provide as many commentary tracks as possible. And it's very important too, because Criterion is operating in this very competitive field of physical media releases now. I mean, there's so many physical media releases now. It's amazing. It's like a new golden age. But that also brings with it a number of pressures too, because Criterion needs to essentially up its game. It really needs to up its game with releases like this. I mean, films like Imitation of Life really deserve that consideration. And Imogen Sarah Smith's discussion and Miriam J. Petty's discussion really deserve that attention. And if the lack of quantity of supplements or the lack of commentary tracks detracts from the brilliance of the film and the brilliance of the discussions, then that will make me very sad, which, again, is my urging to people who might be listening. And if no one's listening, that's perfectly fine as well. But if anyone out there is listening, my urge is, and if anyone has any influence or sway in this area, my urge is to try to at least give us something, and again, budgetary concerns notwithstanding, to try to give us something that we can say could be, again, a wonderful example of the robustness of a Criterion release that has so many avenues of thought and discussion that we can say that are part of the overall package. I want to say that Imitation of Life could have been a great package. I mean, it is a great film. It has great discussions. But as a package by Criterion, I wish there could have been more. And I'm being very honest about this. Now, with that being said, I must say once again that the supplements that we do have are amazing. And please, please, please let me emphasize this again. They are amazing. And I've learned so much. And again, it helps to position John M. Stahl's Imitation of Life and the spotlight given to it. Now, that is very important as well. To give that spotlight, well-deserved spotlight, to the John M. Stahl version in this way is brilliant. Now, perhaps one day we might see, hopefully, fingers crossed, the Douglas Sirk version given its own release. That would be great as well, and we can have the discussion later if we can. But if we can get this spotlight, that's great. Now, the spotlight being given to the John M. Stahl version, now let's see if we can get as much attention given to it as possible. Now, it might be difficult, again, considering the circumstances of, again, its perceived lack in quantity, which might make the statement that I'm about to say even more important. Again, it looks like it's lacking in quantity, and indeed it is, but it is not lacking in quality. And so my urge to you is that if you're still okay with this and totally acknowledging these criticisms of this release, this is still top-notch, and again, for the reasons that I've tried to state, and again, while at the same time acknowledging the weaknesses of this release. So, my dear friends, that is my 2 cents when it comes to the supplements. And now let me turn to the essay, or the leaflet, the fold-out leaflet, which is found here. Once again, I am not at all, excuse me here, this is the fold-out here, and I'm not at all a fan of the fold-out. I've mentioned it before, I'll say it again. I really don't like the fold-out. I think there should be the booklet. Robust, a lot of pages, a lot of potential for writings. So I wish that the fold-out type could be done away with. But of course, I'm not in the room. I don't work for Criterion, so I don't know the ins and outs of these discussions. And again, what budget is allotted to this, and maybe for budget concerns, maybe the fold-out might be an alternative that is maybe less demanding on the finances than, say, a staple book with a lot of pages, a lot of paper, and staples, etc. But be that as it may, my feelings of the fold-out type notwithstanding, the essay is top-notch. And once again, Miriam J. Petty comes to the rescue with not just her brilliance and not just her way with words and her expressions, but again, the points are so clearly laid out. This is an essay called On Passing Between. Oh my goodness. Again, the context of the film, the filmmaking production, 1930s Hollywood, John M. Stahl, the themes embedded in the film, the Beatrice or B storyline, Claudia Colbert storyline, the Louise Beaver storyline, Freddie Washington, Piola, etc. Oh, this is so great. So this essay, On Passing Between, I'm going to put it right here. So this is, again, pardon me for my poor presentation, but that's part of the first page of the essay. This is top-notch stuff. Again, I hate to be critical of this release because it might take away from the brilliance of some of the stuff that is in here. So I don't want to do that, and therefore let me compensate by saying that Miriam J. Petty's essay is one of the best. It's one of the best. We saw her and her great comments in one of the supplements, and now we are reading her great essay. And so, wow, fantastic. On Passing Between. Once again, please check out this essay if you can. It is so worth it. It's so brilliant. On Passing Between by Miriam J. Petty. So with that, my dear friends, I should point out too that the artwork for this, in terms of the cover art design, which is like taking a moment of the film and stylizing it for purposes of this, I think really, and the font, etc. I think it's really well taken. We have, let's see here, art director Sarah Habibi, Eric Skillman, and designer Katya Mezibovskaya. So I think it has that sense of classical Hollywood golden age look to it, which I find very impressive indeed. And it's carried over into aspects of the leaflet here as well. So there we go. So taking images and moments from the film and then embodying them, and with the use of font and the stylized way. I like the way in which, like, Louise Beavers seems to be so prominent here that she is more prominent than, say, the title itself, which I think is so apropos in a kind of subtle way, because it's indicating to us that her storyline is indeed the most prominent and quote-unquote the most significant in terms of how this film is being remembered. So I like that little detail. But in any event, bravo to the art, and credit where credit is due, in terms of the great artwork that's carried on in terms of the traditions of the Criterion collection. And so, my dear friends, these are my 2 cents when it comes to my comments and feelings about this release of Imitation of Life, John M. Stahl's Imitation of Life, from 1934. So, my dear friends, if you have any thoughts or comments, please feel free to let me know in the comment section below. As always, I am very, very interested to hear what it is you have to say. But until the next video, my dear friends, thank you very much for your time. And until the next one, please be happy and healthy and well. And please keep on watching a lot of great, great, great movies, including, for example, Imitation of Life from 1934. But until then, my dear friends, stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.